I'm Tony Northrup, and this is a quick tutorial on how to use the Godox AD600 strobes. I'll also show you how to use the AD600Pro, the Godox X1T and XPro triggers, including how to update the firmware. And yes, it should be pronounced Godox and not Godox, as you'll hear me say regularly. In the United States, it might be known as Flashpoint, supported by Adorama. They're just exactly the same units. First up, I'm gonna assume you got the battery charged and you got it hooked up, that you know how to do this stuff. You turn it on by holding this button down. You will do most of the work from the remote control, but there are some things that you'll do from here, like turning the strobe on. Now that it's on, press the group channel button in the upper right to switch between the different letters. So you can see they can switch from A, B, C, D, or E. This allows you to control 5 different strobes independently, and I'll show you that in just a second, but your key light, your main light should probably be A, and then your secondary light, like a fill light, could be B, your background light could be C, and you can assign more than one strobe to each letter. So if you had 3 background lights, you could control them all at the same time by assigning them all to C, but then they'd all have to have the same flash output. So you can think of it as 5 different groups of strobes, though I almost always assign each strobe an independent letter, and I haven't ever needed more than 5 strobes at a time. By default, it's set to channel 1. This also needs to match your remote. Channel 1 is probably fine. If you're ever shooting around other photographers and they happen to have the same lights, you wouldn't want to be in the same channel, or you'd be triggering each other's lights, in which case somebody would want to switch to 2 or 3. So if you're smart, you might switch the channel to some other channel now, in case you ever run into conflict, because whoever else might be around you probably left it at channel 1. To change the channel, you'll hold down the group channel button and then use the dial here to switch the channel. To change the channel on the X1T transmitters, press the channel OK button once and then adjust it with the dial. There are a couple of items on the menu that you might want to change, so I'll hit the menu button here. The first is beep. You can set the beep on or off. It will beep audibly when the strobe is ready to fire again. These strobes have a very fast recycle time, and I almost never use them at full power, so I turned the beep off because it's never really been a problem. I never need to wait for them like I used to. The slave option here makes it automatically fire when another flash fires around it. So if you're caught off guard and your remote control fails, you could turn on your on-camera flash or any sort of flash and set this to slave, and it would automatically fire. It's a really good backup process. So by default it's off, and that's where it should usually be as long as you're using a remote. But if you do need it to fire when another flash fires in the room, you can set it to S1, that should be the default, or you can set it to S2 if the flashes have like a little pre-fire. Sometimes they'll flash a little bit to get TTL working, but that's not the real flash. That just says, hey, I'm gonna wait for the second real flash before I fire. I would basically just try it on S1, and if it's not working, then set it to S2. Sometimes trial and error is the easiest way to go about it. There is a fan option here. These things have what can be a fairly loud fan. When they get to working, they will get a little bit hot. The battery gets hot. The fan helps cool it down. That's totally fine with a typical photo shoot. Sometimes we also shoot videos and the fan can get pretty annoying, in which case, if you're doing that too, you might set the fan to off. But remember to set it back to auto when you're done, because of course, if it's off, then at some point it's going to overheat and it's going to stop shooting. The sleep option here allows it to turn off after some period of time. Of course, you don't want it to fall asleep if you take 10 minutes to review some pictures, but you probably don't want to forget it on and have it running all night until it turns itself off. The light that it's talking about here is the backlight for the LCD. I generally just leave it on. It doesn't chew up a huge amount of batteries. These batteries literally last all day anyway, so I leave it on just in case I ever do need to look at it. And the delay just specifies how long the flash will wait before it actually fires. I've never had a need to do that, but if you're trying to do some sort of fancy thing where you're capturing a bullet flying through the air, then you might want to do that and have it delay some number of milliseconds. But realistically, you're probably not going to change any of these other options. It automatically detects the remote, so you generally don't have to set that. The modeling light here, it works in 3 different levels. Push it once, twice, 3 times. So you can see you can control the intensity of the modeling light. On the Pro model, press the modeling lamp button to switch between 3 modes: off, prop, which makes the output proportional to the strobe setting, and a variable percentage. To control the percentage, hold the modeling lamp button for 2 seconds. Brighter modeling lamp settings make the fan spin faster and louder. This just gives you a preview of what the light quality is going to look like. To turn on the modeling lights from the X1T transmitter, double press the channel OK button. On the XPro controller, use the button below Mod to turn the modeling lights on or off. You can then individually turn off modeling lights by selecting a group and pressing the Mod button. In bright sunlight, shooting outside, you're definitely not going to see it, so it's better off just turning it off and saving a little bit of batteries. Also, if you have a power outage, you can use that modeling light and it'll light up a room pretty good and last a couple of hours. You'll be shocked how long the thing will last. If you just want to test it and make sure it's working, this little power button, a little red button with the little lightning bolt, makes it fire. Pow! You can turn on the high-speed sync from here, but you probably will never need to because it automatically detects when high-speed sync is needed. The little sideways lightning bolt here, I don't know why so many lightning bolts. This changes the remote control mode. So right now you can see I have it in the little universal wireless symbol. That's for using the Godox remote, which is what you probably should be using. You can also switch it to use like the Canon or Nikon infrared controls. If you got the Pro version of this, it does not have that, but I don't think anybody uses that anyway. It doesn't work really very well, and the Godox remote is great and probably for what you should use, so just keep it in that mode. Oh, one last little tip. I have little Post-it notes here that tell me visually whether it's my A light, my B light, my C light, whatever. And I know that doesn't look very pro, but I have a hard time keeping track of what letter each strobe is, so I end up just labeling it in a way that I can see it from different places. By the way, if you have a light on a tall light stand like this, at some point somebody's gonna trip into it and knock it over, or there's gonna be some wind. The bigger the light modifier on there, the more likely it's gonna fall over, so you should sandbag all your light stands that aren't very close to the ground. This is the remote control. You can turn it on the little switch on the side. Then you might need to fuss with the buttons to actually make the screen come on. If you're using the AD600 strobes, they can go all the way down to 1/256th power, but the trigger by default is limited to 1/128th power. To fix this on the X1T trigger, hold down the channel OK button for 2 seconds until you get into the custom menus. Now switch to FN05, hit the group button, and switch from 1/128th to 1/256. Now push the group button to select it. On the XPro controller, press the menu button, scroll to Min, select it, and then switch to 1/256th. The way I typically set the camera up is I'll put it in manual mode with manual ISO. I'll start at ISO 100, the base ISO, because I know that's going to give me the cleanest images, whatever the base ISO on your camera is. It might be 64, it might be 200, and then I will adjust the shutter speed to freeze the subject's motion. Generally, I'll start with the shutter speed at 1/125th, just because that's what I like. But if you need to freeze more motion, or if you're shooting in the sunlight and you need to go faster, you can, let's move the shutter speed up to 1/500th of a second. At this point, the flash will automatically switch to high-speed sync mode. So even at 1/3200ths, it's syncing just fine. On my Nikon D850, I had to go into the settings, bracketing flash, flash sync speed, and then select 1/250th auto FP in order to get high-speed sync to work. If anything doesn't work right, update the firmware on the strobes and your transmitters. I'll show you how to update your firmware at the end of the video. I will say that in high-speed sync mode, it doesn't freeze action like it does in non-high-speed sync mode. The flash works a little bit differently. In high-speed sync mode, it has to pulse on and off, and that way it makes sure it evenly illuminates the entire frame as the very narrow slit of the camera shutter moves over the sensor. And that means that if something were moving through the frame, you could get a really weird effect. So it's perfectly fine for portraits. But if you're trying to catch somebody running, or you're trying to freeze a splash of water, you probably want to make sure that you're below your camera's sync speed, which is usually like 1/250th or 1/200th or 1/160th. So just get at your camera's sync speed and use the non-high-speed sync mode of this flash if you need to freeze fast motion. The X1T has two control methods. If you have the X1T-S or X1T-O controller for Sony or Micro Four Thirds, you change the groups by pressing the group button. Now you can adjust the power up or down after selecting the group. This is my preferred technique. If you have the X1TC or X1TN triggers for Canon or Nikon, switch the groups by turning the dial. Then press the GR button to select a group and use the dial to change the power output. If you want to switch control methods, hold down the channel OK button for 5 full seconds. To select groups on the XPro trigger, simply select the button along the left side that corresponds to the groups. You can then modify the power using the dial. Once you select your light, like this is the A light, which is the one I was just showing you, you can push the mode button here to switch between 3 modes. The first is TTL. TTL will have the flash automatically adjust to properly expose your subject. So if you were to move the flash closer or further away, then it would increase or decrease the power in order to give you the proper exposure. Only the Pro lights or the AD600B lights support the TTL, so check which model you have. If you have the models with the M in the name, like the AD600BM, that M stands for manual, which means they do not support TTL. By the way, if you try to select the TTL mode and the flash does not support TTL, it will simply not fire, in which case you just need to switch to manual and control that output manually. So in TTL, you can adjust the flash exposure compensation up or down. So if it's working in TTL, but it's a little too bright, you can drop it to, say, -1 will mean half the output, 1 stop less light, -2 will mean 2 stops less light, or 1/4 the output. I actually don't like the TTL system. I don't find it to be consistent or reliable, so I'd much rather use manual mode anyway, so let's switch to that. To do that, I will hit the mode button again, and that switches to manual, and then you can see the amount of output it has. So if I push mode, it goes through 3 different modes. Off, which has the double lines, TTL, or manual. This is useful to know because I have 3 lights set up here, so if I want to turn the B light on, I can just push mode twice until it goes to manual output, or if I push it a 3rd time, it will turn off completely. So let's go back to the A light. Right now, it's at 1/128th. Full output is 1. So 1/128th means it's 1/128th, the full output, or about 7 stops below full output. It's like the power of 2, like 2 to the 7th equals 1/128th. So with that set to 1/128th, let's take another picture here. And you can see that gave me pretty good exposure on our model with my current camera settings at f4. So right now I'm using just 1 light, but it's super easy to switch and add in the other lights. I have the B light set up behind our static model here. And if I hit the mode button a couple of times, that will turn it on. If I fire, I can see that. And I put a red gel on her hair light behind her just to kind of set it off so I could see what's happening. I find it really useful when I'm setting up multiple lights to switch between them and just turn 1 light on at a time. So there I just turned off the light A, and so now only the hair light is on. And so as I'm isolating that 1 light, I can see it's not really putting out enough light for me to notice it. So let's crank up the light here. Okay, so there in that example shot, you can see some of the red starting to bleed through, but let's crank it up 1 more time. Let's go up to 1/4 power. There we go. So now we have some of the red in there. I don't know that I like that effect, but just for the sake of demonstrating the lights, you can see how it works. So now that I have the hair light working, I can go back and turn on the main light to manual and balance those 2 lights with another sample picture. There we go. So now we have a properly exposed picture. You can see some of that red hair light coming through. I have a 3rd light set up on group C here. So I'll turn that one on. The group C light is just going to illuminate the entire room. And there we have a pretty balanced picture. You can also modify all the lights at once, which is perfect for times when you change your camera's f-stop or ISO. On the X1T transmitter, hold down the group button until all the groups blink. Now adjust the power output for all the flashes simultaneously. On the XPro controller, press the button beneath all, then use the power dial to change the output. If you're using the X1T transmitter and you only have 3 lights, change this setting to limit the number of groups to 3 so you don't have to scroll as much. First, go into the custom function settings by holding down the channel OK button for 2 seconds. On the Canon, Sony, and Nikon models, scroll down to FN06, hit the group button to select it, and then change this value to 3. On the X1T model for Olympus, it is FN07. You can switch the trigger to a single contact mode where it will fire with almost any camera, including cameras of a different manufacturer. On the X1T model, hold down the channel OK trigger for 2 seconds until you get to the custom functions. Switch to function 01, hit the group button, and then set this to on. Normally, however, you can just leave it to off. First, I'm just going to plug some of my stuff. My book, Stunning Digital Photography, has a ton of information about portraits and lighting, including how to use all the different beauty dishes and soft boxes and how to control the different ratios between lights. Information that you really need to know if you're going to get the most out of this gear. So check out Stunning Digital Photography. The ebook is only $10. You can pick it up at Amazon, check out the reviews there, or my store, sdp.io/store. We also have books on Photoshop and Lightroom, because if you're going through all the trouble to light it, you better get some decent post-processing done. And my photography buying guide goes into a great amount of detail about different lights, light modifiers, and things like light stands, other gear that you might need to get the most out of your photo studio. First, let's do some troubleshooting. If you put the trigger into your camera and the flashes don't fire when you take a picture, first narrow it down to determine whether the problem is caused between the camera and the trigger or the trigger and the strobe. The easiest way to do that is to do a test fire. This is the X1T trigger, and this is the test button on the XPro trigger. If the flash does not fire with the test button, then you know it is a problem between the transmitter and the strobe, that your camera is not related at this point. First, you can go over to the strobe and push the test button on the strobe. If the strobe still does not fire, then the strobe itself is broken. It doesn't have power or something else, so continue troubleshooting from there. If the test button on the strobe works, but the test button on the transmitter does not work, then we know it's a communication problem of some kind. Make sure that they are on the same channel, such as channel 1 or channel 2. Make sure that the strobe itself is on by looking at the letter and, for example, A, B, or C, and making sure that the letter on your transmitter matches and is set to the mode M. If you switch to TTL and it still doesn't work, that means that the strobe itself might not support TTL. If it works in M mode but not in TTL mode, another possibility is that it does not have the latest software updates. You might have to update the firmware, as I will describe in just a little bit. If the test fire here works and it fires the strobe, then you know that the problem is between the camera and the transmitter, and that helps narrow it down. First, I would take off the transmitter and reseat it, push it back in, and then tighten the screw down so it locks in nice and tight. Just reseat the transmitter. This will solve 75% of flash problems. On the camera, I would also set the shutter speed to a low number, like 1/60th of a second or even 1/30th of a second, and just see if the strobe fires. If the strobe does fire at a slower shutter speed, but it does not fire at a higher shutter speed, then the problem is high speed sync. This might be caused because you don't have the latest firmware updates. I'll show you that in a second. If you have a Nikon camera, make sure that auto FP is turned on. If you have an Olympus camera, make sure that it is set to fill flash. On Nikon cameras, press the menu button, go down to the pencil icon, select bracketing and flash, and then look for flash sync speed. Usually it's set to 1/250th. You want to change it to auto FP, whatever value is associated with auto FP. If you have the flash trigger set to TTL, try setting it to M mode on the transmitter. Your camera can generally be set to TTL, but the transmitter needs to be set to M. Let's talk about the firmware update process now. First up, to check the firmware, Godox has an index of how to check the firmware on their website, but generally the way it works is on the X1T transmitter, turn it off, then hold down the mode button and keep holding it down, and then turn the transmitter on. Now you'll see a number there, and in this particular transmitter, it says 16. It's saying version 16. On the XPro transmitter, turn it on and then push the menu button, and you'll see the version information displayed in the upper right corner. On the strobes, turn it on, and then press the menu button, and again in the upper right corner, you'll see the version information. Now that you know your version information, go to the Godox firmware update page at sdp.io/godoxfw. You're going to look at the model number here and find the model number of your device. For example, if you have the Canon transmitter, it's X1TC or X1TN for Nikon, X1TS for Sony. And then the version number is in the field right next to it. So for example, I had 16 listed for my Sony. 16 is the right version number, so I know that's up to date. But those version numbers will change in the future, so be sure you go to that page. There are two different versions of their firmware update tool, G1 and G2. So if you have one of their newer products, like the XPro transmitters, you'll see them down here at the bottom. I have the XPro transmitter for Fuji, and it is not listed here, and that's because they just haven't released a firmware update for it. So that means that it's still up to date. Okay, so what if the firmware version on your device is lower than the firmware version on the website? That means you need an update, and I am sincerely sorry. This is going to be difficult, but let's get into it. First of all, their tools only work on Windows. Some people have had success using Mac and running a virtual machine. So if you're a nerd and you know how to do that, then go for it. Otherwise, maybe find a friend who has a Windows computer. It helps if it is an older version of Windows, Windows 7 or earlier, and that will make things much easier on you. Now you need a tool to unpackage their files. If they are packaged in .rar files, RAR files, if you already know that you can open that, great. If not, then go to sdp.io/7zip and install that tool. You can find it here. Most of you will need the 64-bit version for Windows. So install this and run this, and that will allow you to right-click it and unpackage it. Once you have 7-zipped installed, head back to the Godox firmware update page. As you recall, there's G1 and G2 types of firmware updates. They each have separate tools. If you scroll through this list and you see the products that you're updating are listed under the G1 firmware upgrade, then you will need at least 2 of these packages. At the top here, you see Godox G1. This is the tool that you use to install the updates on your device. It does not contain the firmware updates. So click the green arrow here to download that. Notice that it's packaged in a .rar file, an old file. That's why you need the 7-zip. Now you're going to scroll down and find the firmware package for the device that you're upgrading. If you have the X1T for Canon, you will download this file. If your firmware update is listed under G2, then you will grab the G2 file here instead, and whichever firmware update you need here. So now that I've downloaded these, let's open up the folder that they're contained in. Now I can right-click the file, select 7-zip, and then extract the file. I'm going to repeat that process for each of the packages that I downloaded. So now I have the actual application here and the individual firmware updates installed here. But wait, there might be some extra steps you have to do before you can even install that application. If you chose the G1 tool, it was designed for a much older version of Windows, Windows 7 or earlier, and that is very outdated. If your computer is not very old, you're going to have to do a lot of work. The first thing that you're going to have to do is to turn off Secure Boot. You only have to do this if you're using the G1 tool. If your firmware update uses the G2 tool, you do not have to go in and modify Secure Update, nor do you have to run the BCD edit that you're going to see in a second. This means that you will have to shut down Windows and restart your computer. You will then have to go into the BIOS settings for your computer, find the option for Secure Boot, and turn that off. I cannot show you exactly how to do that because almost every computer has a different BIOS user interface. So what I would do is look at your computer model number and look for BIOS and how to restart and enter the BIOS settings, as well as how to find the specific option for Secure Boot and turn it off. Now, I am telling you to turn off Secure Boot, and that sounds scary, right? Like if the manufacturer turned on something called Secure Boot, why would you want to go and turn it off? Yes, that's scary. Secure boot could save you from malware that could take over your whole computer, and it's ridiculous that we have to turn it off just to be able to install firmware updates. However, Godox did not sign the drivers that they use to communicate between your computer and their devices. And because they're unsigned, Windows simply will not allow them to install unless you go in and do this. So that's what you have to do. You can turn it back on after you're done, however. Now that you have turned off Secure Boot and restarted Windows, we're going to go into Windows here. And what I'm going to do is I hit the Start menu, I typed CMD, and this brings up the best match of Command Prompt. We can't just run Command Prompt, we have to run it as an administrator. So I'm going to right-click it and select Run as Administrator. Now I have Administrator Command Prompt. I need to type in this command, bcd edit/set test signing on. And if you did not turn off Secure Boot, you will see the error that you see here because I didn't do it on this computer. But if you've done it properly, you will get confirmation that test signing is turned on. This allows Windows to install these unsigned updates. Now that you've done this, you can install the Godox G1 software. Go into the folder that you extracted it to, double-click the exe file, and follow the prompts that appear. If you have a high-resolution screen, like a 4K monitor, this app was not designed for high-resolution screens, and you will not be able to see the buttons or read the text. So you need to change the font scaling in Windows. To do that, I hold down the Windows key and press D to get to the desktop. Now I'm going to right-click the desktop and select Display Settings. I'm using Windows 10 here. Your computer might be a little bit different, but it should all work pretty similarly. Now under Scale and Layout, you can see this scaling here. You need to set this to 100%. What this is going to do is it's going to make your fonts very, very small. Now you are ready to run the Godox G1 software. After selecting English, click Select File and browse to the folder that contains the firmware update that you need to install. It'll have a .fri file extension. Select that. Now it's time to use a USB cable to connect your device to the computer. On the X1T transmitter, turn the transmitter off. Then reveal the USB port by removing the rubber cover on the side. This uses a micro USB cable that should be connected to your computer. On the XPro transmitter, turn the transmitter off. Then reveal the cover on the side here. This has a USB-C cable that you need to connect to your computer. They don't include the cables with these things, so hopefully you have one left over from a different device. On the strobes, the technique is a little bit different. First, you will disconnect the battery completely. Take it off. Easier said than done. Now you'll reveal the USB port on the top of the strobe. Before you connect it to the USB cable, hold down the on-off button for 2 seconds. Now you can connect the USB cable to your computer. If you've done this properly, you should be able to click Connect in the Godox G1 or G2 app. If you had previously connected a different device, you might have to click Disconnect and then Reconnect. If it says Connect completed, then you've done everything correct. If it shows you a red error message, then double check the process and make sure that you've correctly followed the steps to connect the device to your computer. Now you can click Upgrade. This only takes a couple of seconds and then you're done. You can disconnect the device. The firmware update should be complete. If after upgrading you to turn the device on and you see an E9 error, that means something went wrong during the firmware update process. Perhaps you installed the wrong firmware update file. Believe it or not, it will let you install the wrong file in some situations. I was able to reverse that by just downloading the correct firmware update file and reinstalling it, and then everything worked. Congrats, the hard part is done. Now you need to undo the damage that you did to your computer to make this work. First, repeat the process of opening up an administrative command prompt, and now this time run this command. It's the same command, but you're putting in set test signing off instead of on. Next, you'll restart your computer, enter the BIOS, and turn Secure Boot back on. So once again, your computer should be protected. Don't forget to go back into your display properties and set your scaling back to whatever it was before so that you don't have to look at those tiny fonts. Whew. I hope this helped. These strobes are fantastic, but the documentation and the support is almost non-existent. That's why I felt the need to create this kind of documentation for the community, because if I'm going to recommend these things, I want to make sure that people can actually use them. I hope you appreciate the effort. Subscribe to see more free videos. If you have any follow-up questions, tips, comments, write a comment down below. Please give the video a like and share it with your friends, because this was a lot of work for us to make. And you can help show your support by checking out our books. Stunning Digital Photography will do a lot to improve your photography, teaching you how to use lighting and portrait photography and work out all your camera settings. And I promise, beginner or advanced, it's the book for you. I also have books on using Lightroom and Photoshop, because you're definitely going to want to do some post-processing. All these books include tons of videos, so if you hate books, you can just watch the videos. SDP has 14 hours of video. Lightroom and Photoshop have 14 and 10 hours of video respectively. So you can just chill out and watch the videos, or read the books, or switch between doing both. And then I have my photography buying guide, which has tons of information based on our many years of experience reviewing camera gear. And finally, if you're an advanced user who wants to get the most out of photography, to go to the next level, check out our Art and Science of Photography video training series with over 10 hours of video. You can go to Amazon and search for Tony Northrup, check out reviews, or go to stp.io/store and order them direct from us. We ship worldwide. Ebooks start at just $10, so it's super cheap. Thanks.